So some years ago, Claire gave me a gold nugget, a really important piece of information which has been really helpful going forward. She said to me one day, she said, "Ed, I just want you to know I just like flowers. I just like flowers." And in that moment, I could have got really offended. I could have thought how ungrateful she was for kind of all these sort of demonstrations of my love. I was trying to be original and, trying to sort of reach out and touch her heart. She's like, "I just like flowers." So I'm like, okay. And so I've tried to take that on board because she showed me her heart in that moment. And since that point, I've tried to remember that. And so when there's been a moment where I want to touch her heart, I remember, oh, she just likes flowers. And so I bring her flowers. And last year when we were talking about the garden, she said to me, she said, "Ed, would it be okay if I could have some of the vegetable patch for flowers?" And I remembered, she just likes flowers. It touches her heart. So I said, "Yes, of course. How much would you like?" And, we made room, and the vegetable patch has been full of flowers this year. And when she said to me a couple of weeks ago, she said, "Ed, could you give me a budget so that I can buy loads of bulbs so that in the spring we have flowers?" And I remember, she just likes flowers. And this touches her heart. So I said, "Well, how much do you want?" And so she gave me a figure, and I said, "Go for it." And so we've got bulbs planted all around, ready to come up for the spring, and looking forward to that. And so that little piece of information, that gold nugget, has been something that has shaped the way that I've behaved since receiving it. Now just hold that thought, because we'll come back to it. So as a church, we are looking at the gospel according to John. And we're looking to grow as disciples of Jesus. And one of the things that disciples of Jesus do is they're devoted to the scriptures. So the idea is, well, we're going to devote ourselves to the scriptures. We're going to work through this gospel a bit at a time and see what we can learn from it. And who better to go to than John? This is a first-hand eyewitness account of the life of Jesus by somebody who is his closest and longest-serving disciple. And that's the key word, disciple. Because Jesus came from heaven to earth to make disciples. He didn't come to try and get members. He didn't come to get fans. He didn't even come to gather believers. He came to get disciples and to make disciples who would go on and make disciples. And so for us to look at the Gospel of John, I very much feel like we are trying to learn from the very best. And so I'm not going to have time to go through every chapter in absolute detail. I mean, this is a gospel that has layer after layer after layer of meaning. And the more that you look at it, the more you just think, wow, this is incredible. So as we go through the Gospel of John, there'll be things that I will highlight, which I hope will be helpful. But my hope is that in going through it together, each week when we come together, we're going to be exercising that muscle of being devoted to the scriptures. And my hope is that as we look at what John writes, that there will be a grace that is being released to you to actually pursue devotion to scripture in your own time. And so that's the hope. So we're going to pick up today where we left off. So we're on John chapter 2, and we're going to read the first 12 verses of the chapter. So Siobhan is going to read that for us. So if you want to follow in John chapter 2, and we're looking at verses 1 through 12.
Good morning. So we are reading from John chapter 2, verse 1. Water turned into wine. On the third day, there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Now both Jesus and his disciples were invited to the wedding. And when they ran out of wine, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." Jesus said to her, "Woman, what does your consent have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Whatever he says to you, do it." Now there were set 6 water pots of stone, according to the manner of purification of the Jews, containing 20 or 30 gallons apiece. Jesus said to them, "Fill the water pots with water." and they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, "Draw some out now, and take it to the master of the feast." And they took it. When the master of the feast had tasted the water that was made wine, and did not know where it came from, but the servants who had drawn the water knew, the master of the feast called the bridegroom, and he said to him, "Every man at the beginning sets out the good wine, and when the guests have well drunk, then the inferior. You have kept the good wine until now." This beginning of signs of Jesus did in Cana of Galilee, and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. After this, he went down to Capernaum, he, his mother, his brothers, and his disciples, and they did not stay there many days.
Good job. Thank you so much. Okay, so there is so much that we could talk about from just those 12 verses. So I'm going to tell you first of all what we're not going to talk about, and then that will hopefully narrow it down. So we're not going to talk about the fact that Nathanael, who was a disciple that we just met at the end of chapter 1, was actually from Cana. This was his home village. We're not going to talk about that. And we're not going to talk about the fact that the name Cana actually means zeal. And there's a really strong argument that this village was like a zealot stronghold. So this is like Jesus going to like a far-right nationalist terrorist area and, being part of one of their gatherings. We're not going to talk about that. We're not going to talk about the wedding customs of the time. The fact that in Jesus' day, if you were friends or family and you went to a wedding, you were expected to bring a gift that matched whatever that family had last brought to your last family wedding. So you kind of kept a tally. They gave us this much, so you have to at least give that much. And if you were a dignitary or you were like a special guest, you were expected to bring a gift that reflected your status in society, and normally that was wine. And so actually, the rabbis of that time had put in legislation to stop couples from inviting loads and loads of guests to try and make a profit out of their wedding. And so if you showed up to the wedding and the food was inferior and there was not enough wine, you could actually take the bridegroom to court and he can end up in prison. So this is really serious. We're not going to talk about that. We're not going to talk about the fact that Jesus, in creating all of this extra wine, actually made a crisis at the wedding, because he used the ceremonial water pots to store all of this wine, which now meant that there was no water for the ritual washing that the Jews would have practiced over the course of the wedding feast. So now, how are we going to wash our hands? Where's the water that's been set aside for that? We won't talk about that. We're not going to talk about how the miracle happened. The fact that these pots were filled with water and Jesus turned them into the equivalent of more than 500 bottles of wine. But that didn't happen until the servants had taken water out of the pots. And somewhere between that and delivering it to the master of ceremonies, it changed into wine. We're not going to talk about that. And neither are we going to talk about Mary saying to the servants, "Do whatever he says." I mean, how did she know that Jesus was likely to tell them something that would sound completely nonsense? How did she know that? She had to tell them, whatever he tells you, just do it, trust me. So we're not going to talk about any of that. But what I do want to focus on is the interaction between Jesus and Mary, because there's something incredible in that interaction. So, Mary, her sons, so Jesus' brothers, Jesus' disciples, they're all at this wedding. We don't know whose wedding it was, but it seems as if it must have been either family or friends, because Mary has a key role at the wedding. She's somehow involved in the catering, whether she's in overall charge or whether she's just a willing helper, a friend who's I'll help, and but she can anticipate what is going to happen. She realizes we're going to run out of wine and this is going to be a big problem. So she comes to Jesus and she says, "We're going to run out of wine." And That is presenting a need to Jesus. We call that praying. She brings a need to Jesus. Now, how did she know that he'd be able to do something about that? I'm going to leave you to think about that and to just work out that. What I want to talk about is Jesus' response. So, Jesus, we're going to run out of wine. And Jesus says, woman, what has your concern to do with me? My hour has not yet come. Now, he's not being rude, calling his mother woman. That was a term of respect that was used in those days, so we can dismiss that. But he responds to Mary with a quote right out of the Bible. My hour has not yet come. It's a little insight into what Jesus was thinking about when he was at the wedding. So, where does the quote come from? It comes from thousands of years earlier, a wedding where one of the patriarchs, a guy called Jacob, just before his wedding, he had agreed with his uncle that he would work for 7 years to earn the right to marry his cousin Rachel, because he didn't have a dowry. So that was a problem. But 7 years' work unpaid, they agreed, was the equivalent of a sizable dowry, and at that point he could marry her. So at the end of the 7 years, he comes to his uncle and he says, my hour has come. And Jesus takes that, which was now a figure of speech in the Jewish language, it's one that Jesus uses several times. He takes that and he flips it on his head and he says, my hour has not yet come. And what Jesus is saying to his mum is, Mum, this isn't part of God's plan. This isn't on God's agenda. This is outside of my remit. But what he's saying by quoting that from the Bible is he's saying, this is outside of my contract. Like, this would be like trying to get something or take something before you've actually fully paid for it. So this is a big no-no. I'm not allowed to do this. Now, Mary is sharp as a knife. And she knows her Bible too. So she responds and she says to the servants, do whatever he says. And she is also quoting from the Bible. So where does that come from? Well, thousands of years earlier, the Pharaoh of Egypt has his people come to him. A famine has just started to take grip in the land. And the people come to him and say, we've got no food, we've used up all our resources, we need help. And Pharaoh's right-hand man has been preparing for this moment. His name's Joseph. And so Pharaoh says to the people, do whatever he says. So he passes the problem, he delegates it to his right-hand man who's been preparing for this moment, and he says, and now it's over to you. So Jesus says to Mary, I can't do this. This is outside of my contract. Mary says to the servants, do whatever he says. What she's saying to Jesus is, Jesus, you have come to save people. You've been preparing for all of this time to save people. Here are some people who need saving. What's the point of practicing and getting ready to save people if when there's someone who needs saving, you're going to stand on the sidelines and watch them sink? And Jesus steps out of his agenda and his timeline and into Mary's. Wow. So let's just think about that and unpack that for a few moments. So this is going to be revision for some of you, but this is really, really important because this is who God is, it's how he has always worked, it's what he's always doing and what he will always do. So you need to get this. God, in essence, at his very core, is a community. He is the ultimate relationship. He is three persons, three unique persons who are so together in love and purpose and vision and values that you cannot separate them and say, well, you know, they're three individuals. They are three individuals so united that they are one being. And so what you need to understand is that what God values most, what he is most invested in, what he gets most excited about, his number one top priority is relationship. Because that's who he is. He is a communion. He's a triune being. He's a trinity. A communion is like a coming together to make one. So God, when he made you and I, he made us for relationship. He made us so that we could be part of what he most loves and most values and what is most important in the universe. That's why he gave you free will. Because for you to be able to be part of a relationship with him and with the people around you, you have to have a free choice. It can't be expected, it can't be demanded, it can't be required. Because that's not relationship. It has to be something that you choose, you want in on. So God gave you free will. And that's why he adopts you into his family as a child. That's why he thinks of us as his bride. That's why the Bible says that he's given us every spiritual blessing in the heavenly places. And that's why the Bible tells us that we are seated with Christ in heaven. What God is doing is he is raising us up so that we can have a relationship with him. Because for a relationship to be authentic, it has to be mutual. If you have like this power dynamic in a relationship, there's an extent to which the person who doesn't have the power has to say yes, has to do certain things, and that's not a relationship. So God has raised us up and is raising us up so that we have a pull on his heart. He's gifting us that position. You're my kids, you're my bride. So we will never be more powerful than him or more clever than him or anything like that. But he's raised us up so that we can have this relationship with him. And he's made us in his image so that none of us is greater than the other. We are all amazing because that's who he is. We're all glorious, so we can have a relationship with each other. There's no one person who is less than another. So we've all got the same value so that we can have a relationship. Now, when most of us think about our lives and the world that we live in, we think of the problem as being out there. You know, we see war, we see famine, we see economic injustice, we see racism, we see drug dealers, we see the effects of unjust governments, we see greedy medical companies. I mean, we see people destroying the environment. We see all of that and we think, do you know what? If God could just sort out Putin, and if he could just sort out the Israelis, and if he could sort out Hamas and Hezbollah, if he could sort out Iran, if he could sort out North Korea, if he could sort out those greedy companies that have no care whatsoever for the environment, if he could sort out those people who are playing on the stock market with people's pensions and ruining people in the process, if he could sort out the people at the very top of the gangs and the drug cartels, if he could sort out my boss, if he could sort out the colleague that I work with who's just unbearable, if he could sort out those family members that are just difficult to get on with, if he could sort out my neighbour, if he could sort my husband out. I mean, you know, if he could do all of that, if he could sort out everybody else, then life would be good. Now, God is too smart to fall for that. Because he understands that what we see around us is the sum total of my selfishness added to your selfishness, added to his selfishness and her selfishness, multiplied by 8 billion times. And he understands that the world that we live in and the mess that is there is the sum total of my pride, added to your pride, added to his pride and her pride, multiplied by 8 billion times. And it's the sum total of my lust and my greed and my unforgiveness added to yours and his and hers, multiplied by 8 billion times. He understands that the brokenness around us is the sum total of my disregard for his heart, added to yours, added to his and hers, and multiplied by 8 billion times. And so he knows that the solution is in here for me, and it's in here for you and for him and for her and for 8 billion other people. It's about getting back into right relationship with him. That's where the problem begins and ends. And so he's got a genius solution for us. I mean, if people have fallen out of love with God's heart and fallen out of relationship with God, what better solution is there than for a member of the Trinity who has been in eternal relationship and love with God to step out of heaven and come to earth and say, let me teach you how to do this. Let me teach you how to live with God's heart front and center all the time, no matter what the cost. Watch what I do. Watch the way that I live. And let me bring you back into relationship with God. Let me bring you back into a way of living where God's heart is your first thought all the time. And so that's what Jesus has come to do. And that's why he says to us, seek first the kingdom, because he's living with God's heart first and foremost. That's why he says, when you pray, what's the first thing you pray? Your kingdom come, your will be done. He's living with God's heart first and foremost. He's let me teach you how to do that. And so we get invited into relationship with Jesus. And that's why we devote ourselves to the scriptures. Because this is his heart. If you want to know what God's heart is, it's all in here. So Jesus devoted himself to this to teach us how to discover God's heart, so that we know what is important, we know how to live. That's why we devote ourselves to fellowship. That's why these people here are so important. Because God's heart is for his family, so much so that he calls us his bride. And so that's why these relationships are of utmost importance, because that's God's heart. That's why we share communion together. Because Jesus said, guys, this is really important to me, that you never forget how much I love you. And so whenever you gather and you eat together, share communion. That's his heart. He's showing us his heart. It's why we devote ourselves to prayer. Because that's how we discover God's heart. It's by spending time in his presence. It's by listening to him. It's by talking to him. And so Jesus said to his disciples, he said, I don't call you servants. I call you friends. Because I have shown you everything the Father has told me. He's basically saying, guys, I'm showing you the Father's heart. And so you're not in that kind of power difference type of relationship of master-servant. You're friends because I'm showing you my heart. I'm telling you, I just like flowers. So now you know that. It can shape the choices that you make. So Jesus says to his disciples, if you're my friends, you'll do what I command. He says, if you love me, you will do what I command. If you love me, I just like flowers. So let that shape the decisions that you make, the thoughts that you think, the plans that you make. And so Jesus has come to show us the Father's heart. But here's the incredible thing. He's come to show us the Father's heart, but he's come to invite us into a relationship where we can show him our hearts. And that's what happened with Mary. So Jesus says to his disciples, if you abide in me, basically what he's saying is, if you live with my heart front and center, and if my words abide in you, if what I've said, if what's important to me stays with you and shapes the way that you live, he says, ask whatever you desire and it will be done for you. Jesus said to his disciples, whatever you ask for in my name, it will be done. Ask and you'll receive. And so he's inviting us into this relationship where we get to see his heart. And as we bring our lives into alignment with his heart, he invites us, what's on your heart? And he's willing to adjust his plans for what is on your heart. We just read it in here. The plan changed because of what was in Mary's heart. She knew his heart. How did she know his heart? She got a quote right out here. She was devoted to the scriptures. So in a moment where Jesus was like, no, this is jumping the gun, Mary was like, actually, you are preparing to save people's lives. There's a couple here who are in deep doo-doo. And if you do nothing, they're going to sink. So how can you stand on the sideline? And the heart of God hears her heart and steps towards her and says, the plan has just changed. It's the most incredible thing. And so this is what being a disciple is all about. Disciples are people who are learning to love God's heart. They're learning to listen to God's heart. They're learning to make God's heart what is most important. Disciples are people who, once they have grasped what God's heart is, they will act according to that every time, all the time, no matter what the cost. They will do it right away, all the way, and with a happy heart. And disciples are people who, because of that positioning of their lives, Jesus invites into his plans. And Jesus invites into what he's doing and says, you guys get to have a part in it. What's on your heart?